The late Patricia Crone is the famous academic and critic of Islam who wrote the seminal 1977 book Hagarism, The Making of the Islamic World, with her associate Michael Cook. Specializing in early Islamic history, Crone was a member of the Revisionist school of Islamic studies, known for doubting the Islamic sources. In the controversial book, she said Muhammad ﷺ was the equivalent of John the Baptist, and Umar anhu was the Messiah who came to liberate the Jews. Well, her fellow scholars will excoriate her for it. Later in her career, Crone backed away from some of her proposals. But even a critic like her made some incisive observations regarding the caliphate system's unique socio-political achievements that warrant some attention.
Slavery was mostly domestic. Practically all Arabs had slaves. The captives were distributed in mostly quite ordinary Muslim homes. Domestic slavery functioned as a giant assimilation machine. They weren't tribesmen from some impoverished periphery, but rather wealthy capitalists in search of markets and raw materials. But they didn't have to use natives or nativized Brits for the top positions. They could keep sending new men from Britain.
A lot of people today will struggle to get their secular minds around the fact that even slavery came in different shapes and sizes. Slavery in Islam wasn't like the Atlantic slave trade, say, or other colonial enterprises, which were designed to create a permanent underclass to exploit in perpetuity. The point of Islamic slavery was to exploit, for sure, as all slavery is, but its central goal was to initially punish and then absorb you into its population. Unlike colonial bondage, Islamic slavery wasn't industry-driven wealth production in plantations, say, but in domestic services. The majority of slaves were assigned to everyday families to work as maids and servants.
Adopt their religion and eventually be set free. And as freedmen, they were in principle full members of Muslim society. You can't normally become the member of an imperial elite by saying, "Woohoo, I'm one of yours." But in effect, you could in Muslim society, because the Muslim polity was a community of believers. You have this conquest society in which the barriers to membership are set absurdly low. You didn't need a long and expensive education. You didn't need 25 years of army service or anything like that in order to become a member of the conquest elite. All you needed to do was to recite the confession of faith in front of a Muslim willing to act as your patron. It was a totally absurd way of doing things. It's crazy.
Because the overarching goal wasn't to work you to death, freedom from slavery was relatively easy. By becoming a Muslim, a freedman could join the ruling elite. Let's compare this to European slavery.
Westernization did not confer membership of the conqueror's community in either principle or practice, not even for the educated elite in the cities. In short, if the Muslims made the barrier to membership absurdly low, the Europeans made it absurdly high.
As you can see, it's a completely different picture here. You'd hope that getting a European education, adopting Christian values, might expedite a slave's membership into the ruling class. Well, it didn't. This structural discrimination will leave a lasting legacy of racism in the West.
Because the Muslim polity was a community of believers. Anyone could convert to Islam, even a peasant, even a slave. It was easy enough to convert to Christianity as well, but it was a dead end. And the trouble with a nation from an imperial point of view is that you can't have everybody in it. Nationalism makes a virtue of the ethnic and racial origins that divide us.
Listen, if the criteria for joining a club is to become a Muslim, then all you have to do is become a Muslim and you're in. Pretty straightforward. But when the condition for entry is ethnicity, as in the empires of Europe, well, you're just buggered, aren't you? how do you go about altering your ethnicity? In fact, even today, Western societies are plagued by racism and groups in the same communities living divided lives. Making creed and ethos the criteria was the great social move of Islam. You could be an Arab, an African, or even a European, as in the Ottoman Empire. But as long as you shared the same creedal values, you were in.
Anyway, the free converts left their land and went off to be Muslims in the garrison cities, in the Muslim settlements, where they wouldn't be taxed and where they would try to get themselves registered on the military roll, which would entitle them to pay and rations. Like the Maoris, they thought that, and others, they thought that by converting to the religion of the conquerors, they would get access to their privileged ranks. And unlike the Maoris, they were sort of right. And that is what is so amazing about it.
Look, it wasn't just airy-fairy promises screamed from pulpits by the mullah class either. Promises were matched by hard reality on the ground. Even former slaves got equal access to privileges, and this influenced how they saw their own standing within the polity.
And as freedmen, they were in principle full members of Muslim society. Of course, in practice, they were treated with contempt. No Arab worth his salt would give his daughter to one, and they were deemed quite unsuitable for positions of authority, and so on.
As you'd expect, there was at times a reality gap between what Islam encouraged and what Muslims did. But it didn't shift the overall attitude towards the slave class, underpinned by the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We know these teachings were adopted because of the historical events that transpired around the Caliphate.
So it doesn't take long before you begin to find the freedmen all over, everywhere, even in positions of authority. In fact, already in the 720s, you hear of the son of a freedman who was offended when he got a less prestigious governorship than the one he'd set his eyes on because he wasn't an Arab. But the interesting point is that he clearly thought of the empire, the caliphal polity, as his own. And in that respect, he was typical. When non-Arab converts were badly treated, they usually concluded that something was wrong with the Arabs, and especially with the ruling dynasty, but not with Islam, and not with the polity, the empire that Islam had created either.
Because ethnicity wasn't an obstacle, and advancement was based on merit, this made for non-resentful freedmen, loyal to the system, a greater tolerance for it, and a more cohesive social fabric. Upward social mobility wasn't just a pipe dream. You could be a slave today and pretty soon a member of the ruling aristocracy, with considerable influence, as the Janissaries and the Mamelukes found to their credit.
What was there to hold all these diverse lands together? With the result that the native converts had become the main bearers of that belief system. And what is so striking about that revolution is that it was not restorationist, not secessionist, not proto-nationalist, nothing of the kind. And the Arabs weren't made to withdraw to Arabia either. The Arabs were still highly prestigious, but the people who voiced these stridently anti-Arab sentiments, they didn't reject, they didn't walk out of either Islam, the religion, or of the empire.
So even when the Abbasid rebellion erupted in 750 CE, headed up by a group of Persian stock, their target was the Arab dynasty and not Islam, the religion. Islam wasn't conflated with bad governance. Muslims did bad things, but Islam was beyond reproach. Its egalitarian principles were sound, no need to exit Islam. Hence, dynasties came and went, but Islam remained the primary social identity, binding the Near East, North Africa, and Central and South Asia for over a millennium and counting.
In the cities, Islam was an avenue of upward social mobility. The Arabs unwittingly turned the social map of the Near East upside down. I mean, they drew in these huge masses of low-status people, and by simply accepting them as Muslims, they inadvertently made them the pool from which the new elite was drawn.
You might say Islam achieved what Christianity in the 1st century and socialism failed to do in the 20th century. It didn't just hail a spiritual and cultural revolution, it brought about a social and economic one too, a fact often overlooked. By lowering the bar for membership to an absurd level, as Patricia Crone saw it, Islam opened the doors of meritocracy and levelled the playing field for millions of peasants and transformed those archaic civilizations.
So already by the 730s, 740s, a mere century after the conquest, Muslim society had drastically changed. The entire civilian sphere, including religious scholarship, was dominated by non-Arabs, and the Arabs were only just hanging on to their supremacy in the military and political spheres. It is in any case now, well after the empire, that we Westerners are sharing the Arabs' experience. Non-Westerners are becoming the main bearers of modernity, the influential majority of what we used to think of as Western culture, just as non-Arabs became the main bearers, the influential majority in Islam.
The level of social mobility was nothing short of miraculous, for reasons of principle and or necessity. Arabs became a minority in their own empires. Scholarship and administration was dominated by non-Arabs, and this progressive overturning of the status quo would only be matched by the West in the 21st century. Listen, slavery is bad, however you dice it, but it was a staple feature of the late antique world, as it is of today's, frankly. But there's no denying Islam took and modified something bad and uniquely turned it into something positive. Short of banning it through its ethical teachings, Islam made the practice more humane and narrowed its function to a moral punishment for waging war on the truth and fighting the believers. Did Muslims at times exploit slavery for personal greed and inflict unnecessary suffering on fellow human beings? Undoubtedly. Such is the nature of man, as he passes through a life of temptations. Some will pass, some will fail.